It was one of those nights where the air felt thick, almost too heavy to breathe. Alana Roberts had just finished a long shift at the downtown diner, where she worked as a waitress to make ends meet. She was tired, physically drained from serving customers with fake smiles and mentally exhausted from dodging the everyday microaggressions that came her way. But nothing about that day prepared her for the nightmare that was about to unfold. As she walked home through the dimly lit streets of the city, Alana noticed the hum of a police car engine growing louder behind her. Her stomach twisted. In this part of town, cops weren't the protectors. They were predators. She knew better than to make eye contact, so she kept her head down and quickened her pace, hoping the car would pass. But it didn't. The squad car, its tires crunching on the gritty pavement, slowed down next to her. Alana's heart raced. She'd heard the horror stories. Black people stopped for no reason, searched, beaten, or worse. She'd always thought it could never happen to her, but now, in the pit of her stomach, she wasn't so sure. "Hey, you there, stop!" The voice was deep, commanding, and filled with that thinly veiled contempt she knew too well. Officer Derek Stevens. She didn't know him by name, but his reputation preceded him. He was the kind of cop who thought his badge gave him the right to do whatever he wanted, especially if the person on the other side of his power trip had skin darker than his. Alana froze, her back stiffening as she turned slowly to face him. The cop's patrol car bathed her in the harsh glow of its headlights, making her feel like a deer caught in a hunter's sight. "Can I help you, officer?" she asked, keeping her voice as calm and steady as she could manage. Inside, though, she was trembling. "What are you doing out here this late?" His tone was accusatory, like she had no right to be walking home at night, like her existence itself was suspicious. "I'm just heading home from work," she replied, keeping her voice even, though anger bubbled just beneath the surface. Why did she need to justify her life to him? She wanted to scream, but she knew better. You didn't scream at cops like him. Derek's eyes narrowed as he stepped out of the car. He was tall and broad, with a buzz cut and a scowl permanently etched onto his face. He had that look, like he had seen it all and thought less of everyone because of it. His boots thudded heavily against the pavement as he approached her, hand resting on his belt. "Work, huh? You got your ID on you?" His words dripped with condescension. Alana fumbled through her purse, her hands shaking as she tried to pull out her wallet. Her fingers felt numb, her mind racing through all the terrible possibilities of what could happen next. She handed over her ID, praying this would be the end of it, that he would take a look, grunt, and let her go. But, of course, that was too much to ask. He held the ID up to his flashlight, examining it like it was a counterfeit bill. "What are you, a waitress or something?" he sneered, tossing it back to her carelessly. "Looks like you've been loitering." Loitering? Her heart skipped a beat. He was looking for something, anything to pin on her. "I'm not loitering, officer. I'm just walking home." Derek's eyes flicked up from her ID and fixed on her with a look that sent chills down her spine. "You're not from around here, are you?" He was goading her, trying to make her say something, anything, to give him an excuse. "I live a few blocks away," Alana replied, trying to keep her voice calm, but there was a tremor she couldn't hide. "Well, it doesn't look like it." He stepped closer, and Alana's breath hitched in her throat. "You got anything on you? Drugs? Weapons?" "No," she said, a little more firmly this time. "I don't have anything." Derek grinned, but it wasn't a friendly grin. It was the kind of smile a predator gives its prey just before the kill. "Turn around and put your hands on the car." Alana's stomach dropped. "What? Why? I didn't do anything." He stepped closer, his breath hot against her face. "I said, turn around and put your hands on the car," he growled, grabbing her arm roughly and spinning her around. The sudden force made her stumble forward, her hands slamming onto the hood of the police car. Her pulse was thundering in her ears now, panic rising in her throat. This was it. This was the moment she had always feared. Derek began to pat her down, but it wasn't the routine search she had seen in movies or on TV. His hands lingered far too long in places they had no business being. He pressed his body against hers, pinning her to the cold metal as his fingers roamed across her chest, her hips, her thighs. Alana's skin crawled, her stomach twisting into knots as he violated her under the guise of protocol. She squirmed, trying to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Stop moving," he barked, pressing harder. "You're resisting arrest." "I'm not resisting," she choked out, her voice shaky. Tears stung her eyes, but she forced herself to hold them back. She couldn't let him see her break. His hands moved lower, more invasive now, touching her in ways that made her want to scream, but she knew if she did, it would only make things worse. She was trapped, helpless, with no way out. "Shut up and stay still," he muttered, his breath ragged as his hands continued their disgusting exploration. Alana wanted to disappear, to melt into the ground beneath her, to be anywhere but there. Just as her knees buckled, the sound of distant voices cut through the thick night air. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" someone shouted. Derek froze for a second, his hands still on her body. He turned slowly to face the small group of bystanders that had gathered at the edge of the street. Alana's heart pounded as she heard the voices grow louder. People were watching, people were filming. There was hope, small as it was, that this nightmare might come to an end. But Derek wasn't done yet. The voices from the crowd were growing louder, but Derek wasn't backing down. His grip tightened around Alana's wrist, digging painfully into her skin. Her face was still pressed hard against the cold surface of the police car, and she could feel his breath on the back of her neck. It was hot and ragged, filled with an anger that made her stomach churn. She tried to pull away, but the more she struggled, the rougher he became. She knew she was in serious trouble now. "Move along!" Derek shouted over his shoulder to the gathering crowd. His voice was sharp, full of authority, but there was something else there. Fear. Fear that maybe, just maybe, he was losing control of the situation. "This doesn't concern any of you," but it did concern them. Everyone standing there knew it. They weren't just witnessing a routine arrest, they were watching a clear abuse of power, and it was written all over Derek's actions. The racial tension was thick in the air, and Alana could feel it suffocating her as she struggled against his grip. She managed to turn her head slightly, enough to catch a glimpse of the people watching. Some of them had their phones out, filming, and she silently begged that someone was calling for help. Her heart raced as Derek's hand moved lower, brushing against her in ways that had nothing to do with a proper search. Alana's breath hitched. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't just a pat-down anymore. Derek's hands were lingering, groping. It was a violation, and she felt powerless to stop it. She squirmed, trying to pull away, but Derek's grip on her only tightened. "Stop resisting," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. But she wasn't resisting, at least not in the way he claimed. She was just trying to protect herself from his disgusting hands. "Please," Alana whispered, though she knew it wouldn't make a difference. She could barely get the words out, her throat tightening with panic. One of the onlookers, a man with a phone in hand, took a step forward. "We're recording this," he shouted, his voice shaking with anger. "You can't do that, man." For a brief second, Derek hesitated. Alana felt his grip loosen slightly, but just as quickly, his rage took over again. He yanked her upright, spinning her around to face the crowd. Her legs were weak beneath her, and she nearly stumbled, but he kept her firmly in his grasp. "Get back!" Derek shouted at the onlookers, his voice rising with frustration. "This is police business and you don't know what she's done." The crowd was buzzing with uncertainty. Some people shouted for him to stop, while others seemed frozen in place, unsure of what to do. The tension was unbearable, and it was clear that things were only getting worse. Alana felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from fear this time, but from the sheer rage bubbling inside her. How did it come to this? She had done nothing wrong, and yet here she was, being treated like a criminal, groped and humiliated in front of a crowd of strangers. "Let her go!" a woman shouted from the edge of the crowd, clutching a child to her chest. Her voice trembled with fear, but there was a fire in her eyes. Derek's head snapped in her direction, but instead of loosening his hold on Alana, he yanked her harder, pulling her toward the car once again. Alana's body jerked from the force, and she could feel the bruises forming on her arm where his fingers dug into her flesh. "You don't know what she's done," Derek repeated, his voice filled with contempt. He was enjoying this. She could see it in the way his lips curled into a twisted smirk. This was about power, and he had all of it. But not for long. Suddenly, the sound of sirens cut through the air. A second patrol car pulled up to the scene, its lights flashing, and 2 more officers jumped out. For the first time, Derek looked rattled. "Derek, what the hell's going on here?" one of the new officers asked, his tone a mixture of confusion and concern. He glanced between Derek, the crowd, and Alana, who stood trembling beside the car. Derek didn't answer right away. His grip on Alana's arm loosened slightly, but he still kept her close, as if she were his prize. "Resisting arrest," he muttered. his eyes flashing with anger. She was causing trouble. The officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. One of them, a younger man, took a step forward and gently pulled Alana away from Derek. She stumbled slightly, her legs weak from the ordeal, but she managed to stay on her feet. "You okay?" the younger officer asked, his voice soft. Alana could barely nod in response, her body still trembling with fear and rage. She wanted to scream, to fight, but she had nothing left. She was exhausted, mentally, physically, emotionally. As the officers led Derek away, his eyes locked on hers, burning with hatred. He didn't say anything, but the message was clear. This wasn't over. Alana knew that even though this nightmare was ending, the scars would remain. The crowd was still buzzing, the tension in the air palpable. People whispered to each other, some still filming, others watching in stunned silence. But for Alana, the world felt distant. Everything around her seemed muted, like she was trapped in a fog. When they finally let her go, Alana felt like she was moving in slow motion. The world around her buzzed with noise, the crowd murmuring, the police radios crackling, the sirens in the distance, but it all seemed far away. Her body felt heavy, weighed down by everything that had just happened. She tried to breathe, but every inhale was shaky and uneven. She was free, but that didn't mean she was safe. One of the officers who had arrived after the assault tried to talk to her, asking questions about what happened. Alana barely registered his words. She was still in shock, her mind replaying Derek's hands on her, the way he'd looked at her like she was nothing. She didn't answer the officer right away. Her throat felt raw, and she wasn't sure she could trust her voice. "I just want to go home," she whispered finally, wrapping her arms around herself. It was all she could think about. Getting away from this nightmare, away from the eyes that had witnessed her humiliation. But going home didn't mean she could escape what had happened. As soon as Alana walked through her front door, the weight of it all hit her like a ton of bricks. She collapsed onto her couch, her body shaking uncontrollably. She had been violated and humiliated in front of strangers, and the man who had done it walked away with just a slap on the wrist, for now. News of the incident spread fast. Within hours, the video footage taken by the crowd was all over social media, sparking outrage. People were furious, rightfully so. The image of Derek pushing Alana against the car, his hands on her in places they shouldn't have been, burned into the public's mind. It was undeniable proof of police brutality, of the racist undercurrent that still poisoned society. Protests erupted across the city. Alana became an unwilling symbol of justice. Her name was on everyone's lips, though she had never asked for it. She just wanted to forget, to move on, but there was no escaping the tidal wave of attention. Activists rallied behind her, demanding that Derek be held accountable, that the system be reformed, and that justice finally be served. Meanwhile, Derek was suspended from the force pending an investigation, but Alana knew how these things went. Cops like Derek rarely faced real consequences. The system was designed to protect them, to keep them in power. She'd seen it happen time and time again. Black lives shattered by police, only for those responsible to walk away without punishment. Alana wasn't going to let that happen this time. She knew she had to fight, not just for herself, but for every black person who had ever been harassed, beaten, or worse by those in authority. It wasn't just about Derek anymore. It was about changing the entire system that had allowed him to think he could get away with it. The court battle was long and grueling. Every day, Alana had to relive the nightmare as she sat in that courtroom, facing Derek across the room. He denied everything, of course, claimed she had resisted arrest, that his actions were justified. But the footage told a different story. In the end, Derek was found guilty. It wasn't the full measure of justice Alana had hoped for, but it was something. He was stripped of his badge and sentenced to prison for his crimes. It wouldn't erase what he had done to her, but it was a step toward accountability. Alana walked out of that courtroom feeling a little lighter, though she knew the scars would never fully heal. She had won, but the battle wasn't over. For every Derek that got caught, there were countless others still out there, protected by a broken system. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.